Joseph Jastrow was born in Warsaw, Poland on January 30th, 1863. His father was a rabbi, and his brother, Morris Jastrow Jr., was a well-known Semitic scholar that was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. When Jastrow was only 3 years old, his family decided to move to Philadelphia. In 1882, he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a Bachelor of Arts. In 1885, he received his Master of Arts, and in 1886, Jastrow received his Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins and was the first individual to achieve a Ph.D. in the discipline of psychology in America. While attending Johns Hopkins between the years of 1882 to 83 and 1885 to 88, he published a total of 18 papers. His first paper published was a joint paper with C.S. Peirce, who greatly influenced Jastrow. The paper was titled On Small Differences in Sensation. This study that the two did repeated earlier studies done by a man named Weber. These papers looked at passive pressure using a pressure balance, and their findings were the same as Weber's. However, Jastrow and Peirce argued that no one had the right to think of the Lyman, which is a threshold below which a stimulus is not perceived or is not distinguished from another, of sensation as a direct unit. Jastrow wrote his dissertation on the perception of space by disparate senses. His paper showed that a person's vision was more dominant over a person's touch and kinesthetics, where the three senses came into conflict. Jastrow also did studies in composite portraiture, precocity of genius, longevity of genius, and dreams of blind people. At this time, Jastrow began to study the psychology of deception, an area that would pique his interest, and he became very devoted to this topic. After being an honorary fellow from 1886 to 1888, because no positions were available at Hopkins, Jastrow was appointed professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin, which was one of the first chairs of psychology in America and the first west of the Atlantic seaboard. He immediately established the first laboratory in the state. His lab was largely handmade by himself, and it required students to operate the machine he had invented. The course he taught was experimental, and it relied heavily on the actual instrument work of his students. The course paralleled lectures based on principles. During his time at Wisconsin, he stressed to his students that their success relied on thorough research and many articles. Because of this, many of his students had their articles published in the early version of the American Journal of Psychology. During the first few years, the work in his lab was centered around the study of the various phases of sensation, as well as studies on illusion. One of the most quoted studies was on involuntary movement. While teaching at the University of Wisconsin, he not only taught psychology, but he also taught logic, Greek philosophy, and aesthetics. He taught logic and Greek philosophy for only a few years, but continued teaching aesthetics throughout his career. In 1889, Jastrow felt that he needed to travel Europe to get first-hand knowledge of the areas of his interest and psychology in general. He spent 1 year traveling universities in Germany, France, Italy, and Great Britain. When he returned home, he presented his findings in 3 articles that were later published in Epitomes of Three Sciences in 1890. In 1893, he was approached by the Columbia Exhibition in Chicago and was asked if he would prepare a psychology exhibit. He immediately jumped on board to prepare the exhibit. He believed that the best way to attract customers and expand interest in psychology was to make half the exhibit apparatus-based, and the other half by giving the mental tests used at the time to individuals who wanted to be tested. This idea by Jastrow proved to be very wise because the exhibit was a massive hit. In his early years of study as professor at the University of Wisconsin, Jastrow had no help with his studies. He even operated the apparatus that he designed by himself. But eventually, the students he had increased, and he even got an assistant. The longer they were with him, the more importance of their roles increased. One man, Dr. Clark Hall, came to Jastrow as an assistant in 1915. He became an instructor the following year and gained more and more responsibility until Jastrow withdrew from the course in 1919 and Clark overtook the course. In 1898, Jastrow went on vacation because his health was beginning to fail. He had reported that after the Chicago exhibit, he had to have many hours of rest after giving a lecture. The first part of his trip he spent writing articles at Oxford and the second half of his trip he traveled through art museums to gain more knowledge and work on aesthetics. In 1922, Jastrow had minor surgery, but it caused him to take a long period off of work. Further complicating this situation was a rapid decline in his wife, Rachel Sowd's health. When she succumbed to her illness in 1926, he believed that he was no longer able to carry on. He took a leave of absence and resigned his professorship in 1927. He was then appointed to the staff of the New School of Social Research, which is a university located in New York City that teaches many disciplines including the fine arts, architecture, finance, and psychology, just to name a few. During his time there, he also spent much of his time trying to popularize mainstream psychology. His new main interest was writing an article in many newspapers titled "Keeping Mentally Fit." In this article, mental hygiene was a central theme, but he also wrote about more popular areas of interest within psychology. Many of the articles he wrote for the papers were republished in books. One published book even included his title, "Keeping Mentally Fit." Jastrow also wrote his own books. Many of them are a series of periodic articles or are closely related to the lectures that he gave. He was invited to the University of Columbia as a guest lecturer, and these lectures resulted in 2 volumes of books on the more emotional aspects of mental life. Jastrow also served as president of the American Psychology Association in 1900. He left a significant footprint in the field of psychology, and according to Pillsbury, he was a pioneer of psychology. The information from this video was taken from the article titled "Joseph Jastrow, 1863 to 1944, written by W.P. Pillsbury, which was published in the Psychological Review, and what little information that was available on Wikipedia. And I will now leave you with a famous illusionist drawing that Jastrow created himself. Thank you very much. Copyright of Trevor Clarkson Incorporated.